on one of our most committed, valued lay leaders, Rochelle Ludwig, who will introduce the next few minutes as we hear from our guests from Ukraine and now Israel.
Hag Sameach. My name is Rochelle Ludwig, and I serve as a co-chair of the UJA at PAS committee here at PAS. We will shortly hear from Yana Yanover, who will be speaking with us about her family's experience living in Ukraine during the Russian invasion and their decision to make Aliyah. Forced with the uncertainty and violence of war, the Yanover family, like many others, left their home in Ukraine behind and immigrated to Israel this year. It is my honor to welcome Yana, her husband Boris, and their children David and Camila to Park Avenue Synagogue, and Yana to the Bima to share her family's story.
Thank you very much. Shana Tova. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today and to share our story. It's a great honor for me and for my family to be with you, with all of you on this holiday. 1 year ago, we could not have envisioned celebrating the new year with you at Park Avenue Synagogue. But as the saying goes, indeed, man supposes, God disposes. 2 months after the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our family of 5 made Aliyah to Israel and settled in Nahariya last April 4, 2022. All of us, including our 2 10-year-old kids and my mother of 81 years old, had been living under a sudden, terrifying siege with missiles, bombers, and military helicopters over our house in our northern suburb in Kyiv. We arrived to Israel just before Pesach. So the 2,000-year-old dream of the Jewish people next year in Jerusalem is no longer just a dream for my family. I am a Jew born on Christmas 1966 in Kyiv, Ukraine, and former Soviet Union. My husband Boris, who is here with me today, along with the children David and Camila, was born in Kyiv in 1961. Up until a few months ago, our family's whole vibrant life was in Kyiv. Boris and I were very active in Kyiv's Jewish community. I worked for several Jewish organizations, organized Kyiv Klezmer Festival, and partnered with many American Jewish institutions to organize cultural events for the city. Until the first explosions, our kids were students at Or Haim Jewish School in Kyiv. My mother, Maya Zaitseva, is a survivor of the Holocaust, born in 1941 in Slavuta, currently Khmelnytsky Oblast in Ukraine. Her parents escaped from the shtetl on the last military train to Siberia, saving her life. After the war, her family returned to the town. Maya worked as a manager of insurance company until retiring at 76. She was also very active in the Jewish community, serving a board member of the Jewish charitable organization Chesed Avot and the chairwoman of the Jewish Women's Club Chava, which is sponsored by the Chicago Jewish Federation. We could never imagine that she would experience evacuation again in her life. We knew our Jewish history. Israel's operation to save Jews in trouble, like Ezra and Nehemiah for Iraqi Jews, magic carpet for Yemenites, Moses and Solomon for Ethiopians. But now our family, together with our Ukrainian Jews, we are living the next Exodus, part of Operation Arvut Israel. Israel guarantees, just like last spring. We have decided to make Aliyah immediately after the invasion. My mother, Boris, David, Camila, and I drove to Moldova in our own car and were lucky enough to get a flight for Tel Aviv. We left our home and too many friends. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Jewish community in Ukraine was flourishing and growing. Soon after our arrival to Nahariya, David and Camila became students of Shuvu, a school in Acre where the staff and students warmly welcomed them. Many of their classmates and friends are in the same school, which has made their transition easier. My mother Maya received the status of Nitzulei Shoah, Holocaust survivor, by the government. The State of Israel is making everything possible to comfort and welcome her. We came to Israel from one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. You know the tragic events that took place at Ukraine's Babi Yar Ravine, when in September 1941, on Yom Kippur, 33,771 Jewish civilians were massacred over 2 days. It is considered the largest slaughter in a terrible war. Less than a year ago, during Sukkot, my family traveled around western Ukraine to see what was left of the hundreds of Jewish communities that existed there before World War II. We wanted to show our kids the proud remnants of Jewish presence in our lands. There was a former shtetl Zolochiv, where Naftali Herz Imber, the author of Hatikva, was born. We told our children then about the importance of the State of Israel and its national anthem, about the heroes born in our land who played a key role in establishing the State of Israel, people like Golda Meir, Levi Eshkol, Itzhak Ben Tzvi, and many others. I want to make sure you also know the special care Israel is giving to mothers and children from Ukraine whose husbands and fathers cannot travel right now in order to serve in Ukrainian army. Today is a special day because our family celebrates the half-year anniversary of our Aliyah to Israel. Our hope, Tikvateinu, became our new home, Benteinu, and the future for our children, Atidenu. Thank you for supporting Jewish refugees in Israel and for standing in solidarity with us. Thank you very much.
To Yana, to Boris, to David and Camilla, thank you so much. We're honored by your presence. You're welcome to stay, but I know you're going to a million different synagogues, so we're honored to be one of them. We wish you peace, to come in peace, to go in peace. Thank you very much. Wow. I would hate to be the speaker after that.
Fortunately, I get the chance to talk after the sermons.
Dr. Richard Haass. A veteran diplomat, prominent voice on American foreign policy, in his 20th year now as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an institution dedicated to being a resource to help better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. In 2013, he served as a chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. Dr. Haass has also served as Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he directed the policy planning staff and was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass also served as U.S. Coordinator for Policy towards the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College, a master's and doctorate of philosophy from Oxford, the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and one on management. His next book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, will be published in January. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Haass. Dr. Haass, I would say that we're welcoming you, but you've been here all day. You're here every Friday night. It's good to see you, not in the pews, but here on the bema, but don't get too comfortable.
I thought at least one of us needed to look rabbinical.
Well, just wait. By the end of this, I might get you an earring. Okay.
Touche. I should know better than to joust with you.
So, look, we just heard from Yana and their story. I think we have to start with Ukraine. Sure. We've watched in horror as Russia invaded Ukraine in a style unseen since World War II. 7 months into the war, with Russia formally annexing territory and making nuclear threats, and Ukraine making military advances, it seems that a peaceful resolution is more distant than ever. So, Dr. Haass, does this end? Where does this end?
I'll answer that in 30 seconds. First, I'd be remiss if I didn't simply say thank you. Being a member of this congregation is one of life's treats. And Rabbi Zuckerman's sermon was, we shouldn't take anything for granted. I don't think any of us take that for granted. So thank you, thank Cantor Schwartz. It's a special experience. What you said is, alas, true. I think the odds are this is going to be a long war. In order for there to be peace, and I've negotiated, or at least tried to negotiate, any number of peace agreements, there has to be what in Hebrew is known as bashlut, ripeness. There have to be the preconditions, and more than anything, you don't just need formulas, but you need leaders who are willing and able to make peace. And in this case, the critical ingredient is willing. There could be peace, of course, but there isn't going to be anytime soon, because I simply don't think there's an overlap between what Ukraine would ever be willing to sign on to and what Mr. Putin would be willing to sign on to. Mr. Putin, this war for him was a war of choice, but also his goals were not for territory. He wanted to eliminate Ukraine as a separate entity, and the reason is simple. Ukraine represents an alternative future for Slavic peoples who are Russia's neighbors, a liberal, democratic, integrated with Europe alternative. This is something Vladimir Putin could not stand, could not allow to stand. I think it's very hard to imagine that he could agree to something significantly less than that and not appear weak at home, which would, in his views, threaten his position at home. Ukraine, and I was there a few weeks ago, the combination of two things has dramatically changed what the leadership of Ukraine believes. First, it's the atrocities. The war itself is an atrocity. This was an unprovoked war. And then the atrocities on top of that. I went to Bucha. You see signs of just innocents being slaughtered. And on top of that, you now have some military breakthroughs on the part of Ukraine. There is a feeling that the tide of history is going Ukraine's way, that the United States and Europe are backing them militarily. They're fighting they've got a cause. They know why they are fighting, unlike the Russian troops. So there is on their part, no inclination to compromise. So my own view is both sides are likely to fight on for some time to come. And you mentioned it, what we now have to think about is not simply providing arms to Ukraine, not simply helping them economically, but also it's how do we discourage a Putin who fears he is losing on the battlefield, as he is, from escalating. And the escalation could be attacks on NATO countries, it could be, and we're seeing escalation in terms of the attacks on civilian areas in Ukraine, and God forbid the escalation to chemical or nuclear weapons. And that is the focus now. How do we continue to support Ukraine at the same time we try to discourage escalation on the part of Russia?
And I guess to follow that up, I have a simple question. Aren't we at war already? And I mean it, meaning just from I stick to sermons, but right at a certain point we're arming the Ukrainians. The Russians are fighting the Ukrainians, so that's sort of a technical nomenclature question of like at what point are two countries actually at war or a proxy war. And then this leadership role the United States is playing in supporting Ukraine, the arms that you mentioned, the sanctions. I mean, your assessment of the role the United States is playing and the fear that we're backing Putin into a corner such that he might use a nuclear weapon. And so I actually don't know what my question is. Is there historical precedent? Is there a way this is done? Or is it simply to try to bring the parties to this moment of potential de-escalation?
All wars are limited. This one is specifically limited. The president decided from the outset that we would provide Ukraine with the wherewithal to fight a war, but there would not be direct military involvement on the part of the United States or NATO. And that continues to be the policy. What we didn't know is that it would be as effective as it is, in part because of the level of support, more because of Ukraine's willingness and ability to fight, and then the weakness on the other side. You know, at the core of this is the idea that no country should be allowed to acquire territory through the use of force. There aren't a lot of rules in the world. That comes as close to being a norm or a rule that there is. And the fear is that if Russia is allowed to succeed here, the victim won't only be Ukraine. There'll be victims potentially elsewhere in Europe, but other would-be tyrants will see this and say, well, the United States or NATO aren't willing to stand up for this principle, well, maybe we can get some territory ourselves. And I think that would be an even more dangerous world, because if other countries felt we didn't have their back, then the world would become a self-help society, and that means you'd have, among other things, all sorts of countries moving in the direction of acquiring nuclear weapons or other capabilities. So as problematic as the world is now, it's a party compared to what that kind of a world would look like. The messages China would take from it, the messages Iran would take for it, and so forth. So I think the stakes are high, and what makes this so difficult, as you say, is how do we stand by our principles? How do we avoid setting this terrible precedent of weakness? And I wouldn't use the word that we're provoking Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin has put himself in a position where he's running out of options. And what scares me, and the reason I can't dismiss the idea that he might escalate, even though I'm hard-pressed to see the military utility of it, is one of the many things he's done is he is, the word I like to use is deinstitutionalized Russian decision-making. You can't really speak of a government in Russia anymore. It's been personalized to a degree we've rarely seen in history. Just to give you one comparison, during, many of us are old in this room are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s. You are not old enough to remember this. Nikita Khrushchev, at the height of that conflict, was under far greater constraint than Vladimir Putin is today. And that's the one thing that leaves me uneasy. I do not know what Vladimir Putin could not do. I don't know what the limits are, and that's what makes this crisis now so difficult to manage, because we don't want to compromise on the core principles of how the world ought to be organized and operated, but we also obviously don't want to see a situation where weapons of mass destruction are introduced, and that's exactly where we are as we sit here today.
Can you identify either an explicit or emergent Biden policy on these, meaning we pulled out of Afghanistan, we are clearly arming the Ukrainians. In August, when Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, there were fears that China could make a move to invade the island, potential invasion, where the question is, how would the U.S. respond were that to happen? Are there principles here, or is this just kind of like we wake up and we figure it out as we go?
I'd say there's certain patterns. This is an administration that rejects isolationism. It also rejects unilateralism for the most part. This is an administration that sees the way the United States ought to deal with the world, particularly in the political military sense, is through allies. In Europe with NATO, also with a country like Ukraine, with partners, and then in Asia with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so forth. And that's how we deal with our principal challenges out there. I think that's the pattern there. I don't think there's a formal doctrine. At times the administration talks about that promoting democracy is at the center of our American foreign policy. But I would argue that's not wise or sustainable. A lot of the countries we want to support us against Ukraine are not democracies. We want to stand up for the non-acquisition of territory by force, regardless of whether we're protecting a democracy. So I think that's too narrow an approach to the world. So I don't think the Biden administration has come up with a doctrine, if that's what you're getting at. But I do think what we're seeing in Ukraine, and I think it's been largely successful so far, is an allied, cooperative-based foreign policy where we believe in the idea of order in the world. And again, the most fundamental tenet of order is that borders ought to be respected. And I think what they're doing here is meant not just to push back against Vladimir Putin's Russia, but also to send signals to Beijing and elsewhere that essentially what happened in Afghanistan, which I disagreed with, but the administration is basically trying to say that ought not to be read as a template or a precedent. Indeed, I think Vladimir Putin did just that. He made a lot of faulty assumptions when he went into Ukraine in February, but what the administration very much wants to do is signal the world that the United States of Afghanistan is not the United States writ large.
So to China, is there a potential for an invasion of Taiwan? And if so, how would the United States respond? Or how should the United States respond?
Well, it's an interesting month to be talking about China. This week, the leader of China will get an unprecedented third term as leader. Xi Jinping will get that when the Party Congress meets in Beijing. He is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. We had hopes for China, that China would become more liberal politically, more open, more market-oriented economically, and more moderate in its foreign policy, and all three of these hopes have been dashed. And we increasingly face a China in the world that's repressive at home, statist economically, and assertive, to use a generous phrase, in its foreign policy. I don't believe China is on the cusp of doing anything radical vis-a-vis Taiwan, not because it doesn't want to, but it's seen the sanctions, and the fact that China is not helping Russia militarily suggests to me they're wary of sanctions. It's not often focused on story, but China's economy right now is one of the most problematic in the world. Xi Jinping, as he gets his third term in the "be careful what you wish for" category is going to inherit perhaps one of the most difficult inboxes in the world. Tens of millions of unemployed young people, economic growth now below 3%, which is unprecedented in modern Chinese history, how low it is. Still haven't figured out COVID in large part because they won't allow Western vaccines to be used. Severe drought, climate change has really hit hard in China. Demographic problems. China right now has about 1.3, 1.4 billion people. Probably in 50 years or so, it'll be closer to 800, 900 million people. The long-term effects, the tail effects of the one-child policy. The trajectory of modern China is problematic. What worries people like me is whether at some point Xi Jinping is going to see nationalism and some foreign adventure as his way to placate popular discontent. I don't think they're there now. My time horizon is more 4 or 5 years from now, particularly if he wants a fourth term. And I think what the Chinese understand, the mainland understand, is that Taiwan is now too separate culturally, politically, psychologically to ever come into the fold. What the mainland calls rejuvenation will never happen peacefully. It will never happen voluntarily. It would only happen coercively. And that's a possibility. Again, I don't think it's an immediate one. I think it's several years as a possibility down the road. And the challenge for us, for Taiwan, for Japan and others, is we ought to be taking steps to influence Chinese thinking. What we basically don't want is Xi Jinping or anyone else to think that the upside of doing this would be greater than the downside. And that's essentially what foreign policy is all about. So I think the opportunity to shape the Chinese calculus is there. The question is whether we will avail ourselves of that opportunity.
Okay. Let's move on to another fun place in the world, Iran.
Are we on a roll here?
This is like...
You should feel sorry for my family. They have to put up with this all the time.
Just imagining dinner conversation in the Haass family. But
Okay, I'm with you.
So the JCPOA, one day I think it's happening, the next day it seems like everyone's getting cold feet. Obviously, I actually don't know where it is right now, but is there a possibility that there could be another Iran nuclear agreement or not?
Just 30 seconds of background, just to make sure everybody's with us. The agreement was signed in 2015. The United States, Iran, and roughly 5 other countries, if my numbers are right, put all sorts of constraints on what Iran could do in the nuclear space. But a lot of these constraints had what were called sunset provisions, that they would expire after various amounts of time. The Trump administration didn't like the agreement, thought we had given up too much for too little, unilaterally pulled out of it. That's what this administration, the Biden administration, inherited. Ever since then, sanctions have gone up against Iran, have caused real damage there. Iranian oil exports have fallen by more than 50%. But Iran has also used this time to build up its nuclear capabilities. It's doing things, it no longer feels bound by the agreement, so it's amassed significant enriched uranium. It's built a whole new set of centrifuges, and to make a very long story short, it's reduced the time it would need to field a single nuclear weapon from probably about a year, which it was under the agreement when it was enforced, to maybe now a month or two. That's where we are. So the question is whether to get back in the agreement. The administration's been trying to. Europe has been supporting it. They wanted to get a new, what was called a longer and stronger agreement. Iran was having no part of it. So the choice became pretty binary. We go back into the old agreement or not. The downside, there's 2 downsides to it. One is if we go in, these durations, these sunsets are much closer. It's no longer 2015. So essentially, if we go in the agreement, it would buy us, it would park elements of the Iranian nuclear program for about 9 more years, after which a lot of the wraps would be off. So the question is, how much should we be willing to pay for 9 years of parking, which would, again, reduce the amount of time, it would put certain limits in the amount of time Iran would need to break out and build nuclear weapons, but we'd have to transfer all sorts of resources to Iran. A lot of the sanctions would come off, and the agreement doesn't cover Iran's destabilizing activity in the Middle East. It's support for Hamas, it's support for Hezbollah, or its missile program. So that's the trade-off. Iran increasingly doesn't look like it wants the agreement. I would say, based on the briefing I got about a week ago, the odds are about 1 or 2 in 10. This agreement could come back. What's complicated it is the health of the supreme leader of Iran and these protests in the street. So right now, I think it's made the agreement less likely, because if the administration were to re-enter it, it would mean that we would then have to help Iran economically at exactly the time we're having these massive protests, not just over the hijab, but over the economic mismanagement of this regime for more than 4 decades now. So I would think, so far at least, there's no clear sign the Iranian government wants the agreement, because so much of their identity is based upon anti-Americanism. So it'd be hard for them to change course. We ourselves, though, might have a real think about, even if the Iranians said they now want the agreement, is it worth buying 9 years of greater predictability on the nuclear side for throwing this Iranian regime something of a lifeline? At this moment, we have people in the streets of Iran showing unbelievable courage, the women in particular of Iran. So, you know, what we've got, I mean, think about it, 3 geographies. Europe with what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, the Asia geography, not just China, but also North Korea shooting off missiles, and now this geography. We have 3 geographies where all of them are you know, there's the heat underneath the pot has suddenly gotten very high. And the administration wanted to keep the Middle East quiet so it could, quote unquote, pivot to Asia. And that was even before we knew there was going to be a focus on Europe because of Putin. But as that famous strategist Mick Jagger once said, you can't always get what you want. And suddenly they are faced with at least 2 immediate geographies. I think there's a chance that the Asian one could calm down. President Biden and Xi Jinping are going to meet in a few weeks on the margins of the G20 summit in, I think, in Indonesia. And I believe the Chinese economic problems are so severe that I don't believe right now China is looking for a major problem. So my guess is the administration is going to have to continue to deal with what we were discussing in Europe, and is going to have to think about what it wants to do about Iran with or without this agreement.
Thank you. I have about 8,000 questions, but just so if this is your first time here, first of all, welcome. And there will be a moment, a brief one, where I'll invite other people to ask questions, but that moment is not upon us. Okay. President Biden recently said in an offhand remark that the pandemic is over, but we still have thousands of Americans dying and potential of new and deadly waves of infection this winter. Meanwhile, China is sticking to a draconian zero COVID policy with lockdowns and mass testing. So how would you assess Biden's performance on the pandemic, and how do you explain the divergence between US and Chinese policy?
Well, the Chinese policy I alluded to before, this was part of Xi Jinping's nationalist pride. China had a better way of dealing with this and was not going to let Moderna and Pfizer in with their mRNA vaccines. It clearly hasn't worked well, and it's one of the reasons the Chinese economy is in the state it's in. But let me make a larger point here. You know, COVID is COVID-19. That's where we began this, and it's called COVID-19 because the virus was first identified in 2019. I don't find it very useful to think about the pandemic being over, not simply because of what's going on in China, what's going on in this country, but because it suggests that we're going to move into a moment where we're not going to be threatened by offshoots or variants or mutations of this virus or other virus. There's reports a few days ago of a new variant in Russia. So to me, a more useful way of thinking it, this is now part of the woodwork of modern life. That we have these viruses, whether it's variants of 19 or some completely different one, and we still don't know the clear origins of this one, just to be clear. But given globalization and the rest, I just think we now live in a world in which pandemics are a feature, in which the threat of infectious disease is simply a given. I mean, we're used to it in a funny sort of way with things like flu and all that. other diseases. This is more serious. It's got a larger global dimension. So my view is this is a race constantly, and it gets into questions of behaviors, it gets into questions of what science. I mean, like here we are meeting. Imagine what life would have been like had there not been this new generation of vaccines. The original estimates were close to 10 years to develop a vaccine under the old program of developing vaccines. So the science has literally saved us here, and I just think for the rest of our lives there's going to be a kind of competition between these breakouts of new viruses, new infectious diseases, and our ability to contend with them. I think the administration, the previous administration and this one, ran into not just problems at the Centers for Disease Control, which was not quite as professional or as consistent as it should have been, but real issues in our society. And I'm supposed to be an observer of things, but I didn't foresee it with the intensity that emerged, which was resistance to masking, resistance to vaccines became something of a social cultural issue. And a lot of Americans just decided that they weren't going to go down that, they weren't going to avail themselves of certain options and so forth. And I didn't see that resistance, because we didn't see it in much of the rest of the world, but we saw it here. And it's interesting it's a separate conversation of how we came to that point. And the previous administration encouraged that in some ways. This administration fought it, but the results were still that a large chunk of Americans were not going to wear masks, were not going to get vaccinated. There's obviously a desire to live a normal life. Here we are, most of us, we've come to synagogue. There's an implicit degree of uncertainty or risk there. And I think increasingly, every day, I would say every one of us encounters people who probably have COVID. We just don't know it. They may not even know it. And this is now part of our lives. So I think one of my favorite distinctions, my kids are going to groom, is between problems that are solved and situations that are managed. And I think it's more useful to see infectious disease as a situation to be managed. And I think that's where we are now and for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
And the good news is it can be managed, short of some terrible new breakout that we don't have then a scientific response for. So I think that's actually a good news story. I mean, again, not just the vaccine. Imagine what the last couple of years would have been like without the internet and Zoom and without these vaccines. We were able to function as an economy, as a site, as a congregation. We were able to function because of Zoom technology. And now we're able to meet in person or go hybrid because of the combination of Zoom and these vaccines. So the science has really gotten us, it's helped us weather these storms, not solve them, but manage them extraordinarily well.
But there was this rabbi who was asked whether he was wiser because of his afflictions, and he said, well, maybe, but I would not choose to have the afflictions, right, if I could choose it. So, like, Zoom is great, but I'd rather, Anyway. I'm not suggesting you said otherwise, but all right. So let's stir the pot here. Israel. So the number of emails I've gotten in the last week from congregants and otherwise about what's happening at Berkeley and other campuses regarding Israel-free zones and what are we going to do, how are we going to fight this scourge of BDS and that's plaguing our students that often verges or actually is anti-Semitism. And then I also know that a new generation of American Jews are on the rise who have a different and more critical view of Israeli policy than their parents' generations did. And so you have this sort of generational culture conflict between when it comes to American Jews' attitudes towards Israel and how that will play out in the long run and perhaps even affect the relationship itself in terms of American Jewry's role vis-a-vis the American administration to Israel. So I really find myself caught betwixt and between because I hear both voices. I hear the fear of what's going on campus and in other pockets. And I also, I know what I hear from a coming generation where it's not Israel right or wrong.
Well, a couple things. We spoke about this last year, and afterwards, several people of college age came up to me, including one related to you. And one of the takeaways I had from it was that a lot of young American Jews don't have the raw materials they need. They don't have the knowledge, the understanding to have the arguments, and they come up against all sorts of arguments on campus, many of which are, shall we say, rather absolute and not always well-informed, much less balanced. And they lack at times the tools they need to argue back. So part of it, I think, as this community more broadly, I think we need to do a better job of preparing young people for the fact they are going to be in a somewhat hostile world. And we've got to give them the background and tools. And it's so squarely in the Jewish tradition. Think of the Seder. We tell the story. Why? So people know their own tradition and heritage. I think American Jews need to understand. It doesn't mean it's a one-dimensional picture of Israel. Israel's made mistakes, will continue to make mistakes. I think Israel at times does things that are not in its own self-interest. It's not unique. The United States has done things not in its own self-interest. All governments act in ways at times not in its own self-interest. But to me, the positives far outweigh the negatives. And again, young people need to be armed with a sense of history, with a sense of the facts. So that's one thing. And the question is, how do we make sure, as parents, as members of a congregation and so forth, that they get that. It's not unique, by the way, to this subject. I'm concerned as Americans, we don't teach our young people about American democracy. And how are they going to cherish it or sustain it if they don't know how it operates or why it is of value? I just don't think we do a good job in many ways of teaching the next generation. So I'd say that. I think there's the problem on some schools. Yeah, I mean, if I had a young person going to school, and if student fees that every student is paying are going to support groups that are doing outrageous things, and that's when you pick up the phone and you go to the administration and go, why is this organization getting official approval? Why can't I have opt-outs when I pay my student fees as to where the money goes? I mean, I think one has to take on these groups. I just think, I mean, you mentioned I graduated from Oberlin. Oberlin just lost a $37 million lawsuit. An outrageous, and Oberlin's behavior was outrageous, and I'm glad they lost it. Because the administration got involved in a long story, it's been in the American press and so forth, but accusing a local bakery of racism and essentially cutting off all its contracts with them, causing irreparable harm to the business and the family that had been there for over 100 years. And the school was, to some extent, the courts of Ohio said this was not just the students exercising First Amendment rights. The school was, to some extent, a party to it, and the school should have to pay damages. So I would look at what's going on in these campuses. So I think you have to give students, kids, a better means of pushing back, of arguing, and I think schools should be held accountable. Now I'm really going to get in trouble. My daughter went to Middlebury, and she had a great experience, but I got extremely unhappy when Charles Murray was there. He's a controversial social scientist, but a really interesting social scientist. And it wasn't just students, but faculty and others essentially didn't give him his chance to speak. It got, to some extent, violent. And from what I can tell, the consequences were modest. I think schools need to be much more like Bob Zimmer runs University of Chicago. You want to come here? Great. We want you to come here. But here's the rules. Here's the rules about free speech. Here's how we deal with people who come here and how we treat them. You don't want to play by those rules? That's great, but you don't have the right to interrupt other people. You will get suspended, you will get expelled. I think we basically need to create rules on campuses for how we're going to conduct. If we can't have an open exchange on a campus, where can we? Anyhow, I promised I wouldn't go in that direction. I will hear about it at dinner tonight. This just became a very costly conversation. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to ask you one last question. I have 10. I have no doubt that other people have questions. So if whoever has a mic can get ready, but we'll give you this one. So in a recent foreign affairs essay, you wrote, ultimately, however, the biggest risk to U.S. security in the decade to come is to be found in the United States itself. A country divided against itself cannot stand, nor can it be effective in the world, as a fractious United States will not be viewed as a reliable or predictable partner or leader. So as we approach the midterms, the American public seems to be as divided and fractious as ever. Can you see a path to fixing our democracy, and what will happen to the world order if we don't?
Look, the reason I wrote this piece is I'm genuinely worried. It's the combination of what you and I have talked about, these three parts of the world, where we have the revival of what we call, geopolitics. We haven't even mentioned the global challenges, things like climate change. We did talk about pandemics, but we've got all sorts of global challenges for which the machinery is inadequate. And the response to these global challenges is not even close to being what it needs to be. Indeed, the gap is in many cases getting bigger. And all of this against the backdrop of what's going on here. And I would simply say the last 75 years of history since World War II have been remarkable. There is no other period in modern history, in any period of history, that has been as successful, where you had the end of the colonial era, you had more people moving into partially or fully democratic societies, standards of living went up countless times, lifespans increased by decades, plus there wasn't a war between the great powers of the day. There were wars, I get it. But think about the first half of the 20th century, the two world wars, and the depression in between it, and think about the last 70, 75 years, extraordinary contrast. And it didn't just happen. Good things just don't happen. It happened in no small part because of the leadership of the United States. Things that we did, working with others, to build institutions after World War II, alliances, and to some extent the example we set. People saw American democracy, the American economy work, and they say, I kind of like that. The best way to promote democracy is to have a really good one here at home. But suddenly people see what's going on here, and they see not just our economic mistakes, recent ones at the Federal Reserve, what happened in 2007, 8, 9, but also more importantly, see January 6th, see our inability to get things done, to pass legislation, and see the changes. We've always had changes from one administration to the other, but to use a football metaphor, the changes used to be within the 40-yard lines, not within the end zones. And these are countries that have basically put their security in our hands. And they look at what's going on here, and they say, can we count on the Americans anymore to be there for us? And will they be able to agree? Now, we've come together pretty well on Ukraine so far. I think it's quite impressive. It's been largely bipartisan. Pretty tough line on China is shared by both parties. So we can come together still. I don't want to make it more dire, but I think there are bigger questions about the future of this society, about our democracy. I don't think there's a solution in the sense that someone's going to come along and save us from ourselves. The reason I wrote this book that's coming out in a few months is I actually think, Ronald Reagan said something like, he basically said, there's nothing more important than what happens at the dinner table. So I think parents have a role. I think schools have a role. I think people in your position have a role, not to sell policies, but behaviors. The idea that, who better than the clergy to talk about nonviolence? That no matter what your political commitments, there's no cause that justifies violence in order to promote it or pursue it. Or teachers can talk about the importance of getting informed and how to get informed. We're going to have an election in a month. If traditional statistics hold, more than half of Americans aren't going to vote. Eligible voters in an off-year election. Why not? Why is that not happening? What can be done to increase the percentage of Americans who vote? We just had a family from Ukraine. People in Ukraine are dying for the right to vote. And we're voluntarily not exercising it? Why is that? What's the matter here? What is going wrong with Americans' democracy? Why is it possible to graduate from virtually every high school and college in this country and not have taken a course in civics? Now, they're offered in many colleges, but you're not required to get it to get your degree. Why do we allow that to happen as parents who are paying $75,000 a year for our kids to go to these colleges? Why don't we demand that our kids get a basic grounding in civics? So again, I think there's things to be done. It's not going to happen overnight, but we've got to claw back our democracy. And there's lots of things that we need to, and I think in a sense, it's going to have to happen from the ground up. It's not going to be delivered to us. And I think we have to basically fight. I don't usually like the word fight, but we have to work to keep it.
I certainly hope when your new book comes out, you think of us as a place to try to sell it when you come in.
That's a really hard
we'll book you. So with that, our Director of Content and Innovation, Rabbi Kaufman, has a mic in her hand. Does anyone have any questions in the last few moments here? I always like to look at young people over there. Sorry, which is not where. Hold on. I'll repeat it if people don't hear it and on live stream. Yes. Hold on, we got it there.
What are your thoughts on the Italian election and what some people have called her a fashion? Rachel.
Rachel what?
Eisenhart.
Hi, Rachel Eisenhart.
Hi.
I'm so proud of you.
Shana
Look,
Tova, Rachel Eisenhart.
You're speaking to Richard Haass. All right, Italian.
The Italian elections. Look, it's another sign of how powerful populism and nationalism are, that disaffected societies will make big choices. They know what they're against. They don't necessarily understand in many ways or appreciate all that they're voting for. We also don't know how this new government will govern. It's one thing for populists to articulate extreme stances when they're in opposition, and then the day after you gain the responsibility for governing, suddenly things change. I mean, look what's happened, not that it's a very different situation, don't get me wrong. Look what's happened in Great Britain in the last week. Look how quickly the new government came in, announced all these fairly, shall we say, far-reaching economic policies, and they lasted, 48 hours? Because again, the markets have a voice. So I think it's a basic question of what the new Italian government does, as opposed to what it said it might do. I also think that even if it does break ranks on Ukraine a little bit, it won't matter that much. There's so much solidarity in Europe right now, given Poland, given the UK, given Germany, given the US leadership, that I'm not that worried about their ability to do things that would create real problems for the stance on Ukraine. But we'll just have to see. Again, governing is a very different thing than politics. And if they don't do well, the pendulum will swing against them. And that's what we're seeing in places in Latin America. When populists of the right come in, they become the incumbents in the establishment. And if they can't deliver, then often the pendulum swings the other way. We had a little bit of an element of that in Brazil. We'll see what happens in the second round of the elections there.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I see another young person. Rabbi, do you see? It's hard for me to see, but I think so. And introduce yourself, please.
Hi.
No,
hi.
hi isn't an introduction.
Well, I was going to do. Okay, sorry. Natasha comments. Hi.
Hi, Natasha. Good to see you.
Hi, Natasha.
Hi. What are your thoughts on Russia's hold on natural gas and oil? Also considering the recent pipeline explosion,
Sure.
And the impact of that on Europe as well as on China.
Good question. I believe Mr. Putin went into this war made many assumptions that he had held many assumptions that turned out to be wrong. One of his assumptions was that Europe's energy dependence on Russia would limit any freedom of action to oppose him. And he's been largely wrong. Now, it turns out, things like oil you can get from lots of places. Natural gas was the principal energy form, and the reason natural gas is so much more significant is the infrastructure of natural gas cannot be quickly recreated. Pipelines take a long time to build. Liquefied natural gas terminals take a long time to build, and so forth. But Europe has reacted with surprising speed. And I think there's a good chance that Europe will get through this winter. It'll be difficult. It'll be cold at times, and it'll cause some economic slowdowns. But I don't, at the moment, think that Europe will break this winter on account of energy shortages. And once they get through this winter, not just the weather gets better, but then it's more time to build some of this new infrastructure for liquefied natural gas, more time for renewables, and so forth. So I think this winter is critical, and everybody realizes that. And one of the reasons it was so important for Ukraine to make some military breakthroughs was to create the sense that this is not a hopeless cause, and that would increase the odds that Europe would stay the course through a cold, difficult winter. So I think that's what we're seeing. In terms of the sabotage of the pipelines, it was sabotage. You could have one accident. You don't have that many at the same time. My guess it was Russia. I don't have proof. That's just my reading of the situation. You always ask who would benefit. And what it does is, in the short run, it increases the pain, potentially, on Europe, the pressure. Again, what Putin's trying to do through his nuclear threats, through his energy cutoffs, is break the will of the Europeans. I think it's really unfortunate for Russia in the long run. What it will do is destroy Russia's reputation as a reliable supplier. And if you're in the energy business, it's important you're seen as a reliable supplier. In the meantime, what Russia's doing is selling oil, often discounted oil, to China, India, and other countries. They're only too happy to take it. Ultimately, it might find other places for its natural gas once it builds the necessary infrastructure. But the energy situation has proved less of a weapon for Mr. Putin than many people feared as recently as two or three months ago. So I think that's mildly good news.
Okay. One more question? You're not young. Sorry, doctor, but no, you're sitting next to that person. All right, let's do it just because, I was teaching a class yesterday and someone said, the students in the class, this was at JTS Rabbinical School, and they said, Rabbi, there's a high-pitched sound in the room. You wouldn't be able to hear it, and I was like, oh my, that's ageism right there. All right, so Morris, you get one, and Caroline, you get the last one. So one, and then and Caroline. So let's do both questions at one at a time. So yes.
You feel better. I think you're kind of young.
Little.
A question from a not so young person. Simple question. It seems to me that all the problems you talked about seem to hinge on the ability of this country to lead. And isn't it essential for us to lead that we solve the problem here of those people who don't believe in the legitimacy of our government, whether they're on the right or the left? And how can you see that resolved within a reasonable period of time in a reasonable way?
All right. Great question, Morris. Caroline, you get the last question.
Sure, I'm Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
I grew up in New York and went to college in Boston in a very well-educated, very socially liberal Democratic bubble, and spent the last couple of years in rural Vermont, often doing working-class things with working-class people who voted blue but were very pro-guns and didn't want to hear what other people did in the bedroom or what kind of clothes they wore, and am now living in Utah, where the sort of Democratic Party is actually independent, and it's been interesting seeing how many faces of the party there are. And I think we've seen with Republicans that the sort of well-educated elite has not held the party, and I am curious to hear in what direction you think the parties will go over the coming years, and whether the two-party system will stand.
I actually think they're connected.
Well, first of all, you have the wrong Haass sitting up here. It's question better for Sam, who's in this, does this for a living. Look, both parties have always had competing tendencies. That was the whole nature of parties. When you have two political parties in American history, the idea was within each party, you had compromises that were made. I think parties themselves have become structurally much weaker. The way we raise money and so forth in politics, access to media, individual candidates have become much more independent. They have sources of money that the party doesn't control, given our financing system. And so parties have become structurally weaker, I would say. And I don't see that changing. This Supreme Court is not going to change any of those rulings. And the technologies. We're moving away from centralized technologies and so forth. So I don't see a major revival. I think the Democratic Party is more recognizable. It's got tendencies within it, more centrist, more progressive. My guess is that continues to coexist. And in certain parts of the country, one or the other might be more pronounced. But the platform for a Democrat in parts of this city are going to be different from the platform of a Democrat in other parts, say in a non-urban area elsewhere in the country. I think the Republican Party faces a bigger challenge, and I say this, full advertising. I was Republican for 40 years. About 2 years ago, left the Republican Party. Wasn't comfortable with what was going on. I think the Republican Party, what I would call traditional conservative republicanism for the time being has been certainly in many parts of the country has been eclipsed. And a lot is also because of closed primaries, who gets to vote. And it's those who are registered Republicans are already a fairly small percentage, and those who actually are animated enough to vote keep pushing the party in a certain direction. What I'm not smart enough to know is whether this is a phase, to some extent tied to a certain individual, or whether it's deeper than that, and how much longer lasting is. So I don't know. I think this question of the future of particularly the Republican Party it remains to be seen. But I see enough people in there that I haven't totally given up hope, but I'm worried. And I think a lot of people have swallowed their principles out of expediency, and that's never a good thing. But we'll see if we can, which kind of gets me to the other question. I think it's a dangerous patch in American politics right now. One of the things I've learned in the last few years is don't assume things. So I never thought we'd be having this conversation, because I used to wake up in the morning, I used to worry about the Soviet Union or Russia later on, or China or Iran or what have you. But American democracy was something I kind of took for granted. I mean, all of us, I think, have in our own lives. You can't deal with everything every day. Some things you just kind of say, okay, I know that's still okay, but I'm going to focus on the things that I know are probably not okay. Well, now we've reached a point where American democracy can't be assumed. And you've got lots of people getting involved in American politics who still think that the last election was totally illegitimate, so-called supporters of the big lie. There's, from what I can see, zero evidence to support their contention. Yet there's a significant chunk of the population out there that is vehement in that point of view. And I think all you can do in such a situation, again, it's back to what I said before, is you put information out there, you give people tools to deal with these statements that are made, you get involved. I mean, if only a tiny percentage, 1 or 2 more % of Americans decide to show up at the polls this November or 2 years from now in the presidential elections, that'll have enormous impact. So I see this as a problem, as a challenge, but it's, So I'll end on what for me passes as an optimistic note. I'm not known for those. Look, there's nothing inevitable here. There's nothing that's baked into the cake, be it about any of these international situations or certainly about the domestic one. It's on us. And we're going to ultimately decide whether this republic of nearly 2.5 centuries survives, and if so, in what form. The line about Franklin when he, after the convention in Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention, and someone ran up to him and said, what do you all decide? What do you agree on? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. Okay. So once before in our history, we nearly lost it, and we had a civil war. And this is, I think, the second great challenge of American history. And the question is whether we can keep American democracy in a recognizable form and not have it deteriorate. And the good news is this is still an open question. The bad news is it's a question. But the good news is it's an open question, and we're going to have an opportunity in a month to make some statements, whether we vote and how we vote. And I would, actually, you didn't raise it. Can I have 2 more minutes?
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
You don't have lunch plans? So I would say that we've reached a point where I think the situation's in enough balance that voting for people who support American democracy should be very important. And it might mean at times taking our, and it's not always easy, because it might mean on occasion putting your policy preferences on the back burner. And you may say, I disagree with this person on this economic policy or on this social policy, even on, or support Israel. But unless we preserve American democracy, we're not going to be able to have these policy debates in 5 or 10 years. And I think that is where we are. So I would hope that a lot of Americans, when they think about who they support in 22 and 24, would put a priority on this issue of, okay, so I'll go there.
I wrote the question. I didn't ask it, but I think I know where you're going.
Should I go there?
Yeah, but yeah.
It's probably a bad way. It's a bad way to wind it down. But
no, I'll ask you a fun question at the end.
Okay. But I had a public spat with AIPAC over just this, where AIPAC was supporting people running for office this time around only on the basis of their policy vis-a-vis Israel, and they were willing to send money to candidates who also supported the big lie and were election deniers. And I said, I thought this was a big, big, big mistake. That in the long run, if we didn't have a robust democracy, I wasn't confident about long-term American support for Israel. Too easy to change it. Also, I wasn't comfortable about the position of Jews and the rise of anti-Semitism. So I said to simply support candidates on the narrow calculus of their support for an Israeli government's policy, rather than supporting them in the totality of things, including their support for democracy here at home, I thought was of questionable wisdom as well as morality.
Look, you don't have to go to rabbinical school to know that 2 wrongs don't make a right. But doesn't every lobbying organization put their cause at the forefront of their interests? Meaning, we can debate what it means to be pro-Israel. We have active debates at my dinner table as what that word means, pro-Israel. But I don't think whoever the lobbying organization, working on behalf of reproductive rights or gun rights or any sort of rights, is at all apologetic that they put their cause at the forefront of their concern.
And I would say the same thing to them. I think we've reached a point in American political history where whatever your view on reproductive rights or guns or other, that I would simply say think twice before you support a person for public office based on that calculus if that person does not believe in American democracy. In the long run, I would worry.
All right.
All right.
So we'll ask you a question,
That
the
was
real
clearly not a
only
fun question.
conundrum of the day.
Yes, sir.
So I am told, not that a rabbi should know such a thing on Yom Kippur, that Aaron Judge hit his 62nd home run last night. So Dr. Haass, online and being live streamed to thousands, do you feel that Aaron Judge is the historic home run leader, or do you give credence to the records that Sosa and McGuire and Bonds have? Can you please speak to the question?
But first, a historical reference. Here we are, Yom Kippur. We all grew up with the unbelievable, inspirational story of Sandy Koufax. What most of you don't know, I would bet.
You sound like me.
I know. You've taught me well. What most of you don't know is who pitched for the Dodgers that night instead of Sandy Koufax, and what happened. It was Don Drysdale, one of the great pitchers in baseball, who had one of the worst nights of his career and gave up several home runs and was pulled out of the game after a couple of innings. And goes up to the manager and says, "I bet you wish I was Jewish too." Small aside. You like that?
I like it.
That's not bad. Yeah, I think I love what Aaron Judge has done and how he's done it. He's a throwback. And to be the best and to play by the rules, what a great role model. What a great role model. That no drugs, his love for his family, and he said, "I didn't care that I didn't come," I think his quote the other day, it doesn't matter, I didn't come from my mother's stomach, he was adopted, I came from her heart. I love what he had to say. I mean, what a great role model for young kids, that you got that kind of excellence and that kind of character. MVP.
All right. Friends, join me in thanking Dr. Haass. I think Mincha is at 4, Ne'ilah at 5:30, fast ends at 7:12. Have a good afternoon, everyone.